Despre orice discutăm în acest moment, de la comportamentul în trafic și până la performanță economică, toată lumea se întoarce cu discuția la educație. Și cum podcastul de astăzi va fi despre educație, am adus aici alături pe Martin Birchall. Hello, Martin.
Hi.
Specialist în educație din Marea Britanie și vă promit că va fi o discuție extrem de interesantă. I'll switch now to English.
Thank you.
And my first question is, you stayed in Romania for how long?
I arrived originally in 1997.
Whoa,
so we're now talking 29 years.
So you can make, let's say, a brief comparison between the educational system in UK and in Romania.
Oh yeah, very much.
And from your point of view, what are the main differences between these two systems?
I think the key difference would be the British system is much more based around the Socratic method. So the student is challenged to think and to come up with ideas rather than to be given information and confirmed opinions, which they then have to memorize and return in the exam through the written answers. So the British system, example, for instance, with the British system, when they look at history, would say, what were the causes of the Second World War? And the student would be, in the course of the study, would learn various possible causes, but they would have to interpret, come up with their theory. Whereas in Romania, it's much more, here are the three things that caused the Second World War. And they go into quite a lot of detail, but the student is merely memorizing that detail. They're not actually analyzing. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it's not a very proactive form of education. And I don't think it helps to generate the self-regard, which is the key thing for students, because self-confidence is okay, but it's often a false face. Everybody knows, you meet somebody who's not very confident, you realize that because they tell you about themselves, how successful they are, how smart they are, whatever. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that because they're fearful that you might think they're not that smart. Whereas someone who's got self-regard is more grounded and says, this is who I am. You will begin to realize that I'm capable, whatever. So I think the Socratic system is much more conducive to building a stronger, more resilient individual.
How interested is the Romanian system, educational system, to learn from others' experience? Because we were talking some days ago about having experts coming from UK, they left Romania pretty disappointed because nobody was listening to what they had to say.
There's been a lot of exchange and attempts to bring different ideas. Clearly, education is a very dynamic process. It doesn't stay still. You get technology that brings in new subjects. They're now studying AI. If you go back 30 years ago, the informatics department was quite small, particularly in high schools. Now it's an integral part of education. So it changes in that sense. But also, the change is brought about by more contact, more exchanges, etc. I think there is still a certain resistance, to be perfectly blunt with you, in Romania, to change because they're not sure quite where it leads to. They don't want to take too many risks. But the reality is you can't move forward in life unless you take some risk. Now, you don't want to take crazy risks, but you do need to put a fair element of risk into people's persona and their personality so that they are pushing and developing in a constructive way. And I think there has been resistance in Romania to changes, particularly in the public high school system. If you look at, for instance, at the national assessment exam, it's an awful lot of data, an awful lot of information, not a lot of analysis. So it rewards students who've been well taught, well drilled, like a military marching sequence, rather than encouraged to think and come up with ideas. Because once you go outside the educational system into the real world, you are challenged every minute by varying circumstances. So one looks at areas like, for instance, IT, where Romanian students have a very strong fundamental base in mathematics. But they've not been able to develop that into commercial enterprises, into significant R&D achievements. You don't see Romanians winning major prizes beyond the high school sort of
Olympics,
which they do well at because they're drilled for that. And it's a very brutal system. Elimination, only the best go forward. And many of the academies high schools that focus on those neglect almost everything else apart from winning that particular subject Olympiad. So the broader education has
one of them actually became president of Romania. So
although he had a lot of high school education in France.
Mathematics Olympiad. So
don't forget, he did have a lot of his education was in France, where he had a different system. So I think in that sense, there's work to be done. Yeah, Romania needs to really review, because a vast amount of resource, financial and human, is put into education, and actually the returns are not that great when you think about it.
Actually, we had a lot of chat and talking about reform.
Yeah.
And I remember that that was a thing when everything started in the 90s.
Sure.
One of the main talking points was educational reform.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing this every single year, that we should reform the system, we do blah, 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 blah. We had a lot of education ministers during, I don't know, in these 30 years, I think it was one of the ministries with the most...
The highest turnover.
Yes, exactly. But in the same time, I'm looking to what are my kids doing right now. They are 13 years old, and it's not a big difference between what they are, how they are learning and what they are doing right now in school, and what I was doing 35 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. So why is this happening actually? Because we talk a lot about reform, but the education is pretty much the same as it was before 89.
I think there's two elements to that answer. One is obviously the political element. You need to have a consensus for political process to work. Somebody has to be empowered, a ministerial team, and they have to have the support to take through a period of 1, 2, 3 years to actually implement, to develop a reform program and then implement it. And when you have the turnover now that you have currently, and for the last 20 odd years, where the Minister of Education changes almost annually, nobody really gets a chance to implement the political initiative. And at the operating level, the ministry officials, in the territories and in the schools themselves, there is an inertia because nobody's really giving them clear direction. It's a case of if you don't do anything, if you don't change anything, you're not taking any serious risks, so you can't get it wrong. The reality is you don't actually improve that much. So I think that what needs to be done is you do an extensive and in-depth review, and I do this myself because it's my area of activity. I follow, for instance, 2 countries very closely. Well, actually 3. I follow the United States because obviously they're a leader. But many aspects of their education is not particularly admirable. But in certain areas, particularly universities, particularly postgraduate, they're outstanding. But I look at 2 countries. I look at Singapore and I look at Israel. Not to do with the politics or religion or anything, but simply to do with both of them are small countries that have no natural resources. There's no oil and gas in Israel. There's no oil and gas in Singapore. So they're dependent entirely on their human resource. They're also surrounded by relatively antagonistic neighbors. In the case of Israel, directly antagonistic. In the case of Singapore, commercially and politically and socially antagonistic. Across the Straits, you have Indonesia, 360-odd million people. Singapore, 6 million. So to be able to survive in that region, they need, like Israel, to absolutely focus on their human resource. Now, when you look at what they're doing, it's a dynamic process. It's always looking to improve. They're challenging themselves. And not just exam results, where both those countries do very well. But how can you work with the lower quartiles in terms of exam performance to improve their performance, or to give them things that are more relevant to their skill sets? Like, for instance, a greater focus on vocational education. Romania had, when I first arrived, some very good vocational education.
It's true.
It's really good.
That. The professional schools, or how they were called, I don't remember. Yeah,
they train young people for a trade or a particular occupation. I remember visiting one in Bucharest that trained students for work in hospitality, hotel, restaurants, catering. And it was giving good foundation. All of the things that you need in a society, and you need them to be good. And those schools were setting young people on good careers. I mean, after all, an electrician in many countries earns a very high salary in comparison with a lot of other jobs because it's an important job. It's complex plans and buildings, etc. So you want the world trained.
So you say that the disappearance of this kind of vocational schools was a big problem.
Oh yeah, it was a very silly mistake, and it was one particular minister of education. She took the decision to scrap these schools, and it was a disaster because they weren't replaced with anything other than this idea that somehow you could increase the number of students attending university. But the point is, in any institution, be it vocational, be it very academic, you want it to be performing at the optimal level. So you want Polytechnica to be at the optimal level for IT. You don't want it to be having to cater for a very broad range of students, many of whom are just not really suited to being in a university. Likewise, a vocational school should have people who want and understand and have talents for that particular vocation. Going back to Singapore and Israel, they are very conscious of that segment and how do we maximize the benefit for the individual and for the society. In Romania, they're inclined to cast them out. Then what do? They go on e-jobs, they look for a job. I talk to them, what are you looking for? No, they're basically looking for the job that will pay them the highest hourly rate. They don't do any kind of analysis. They don't have any support to work out what they're actually suited for. So maybe someone who, for instance, has very good interpersonal skills should be looking at sales. Someone who may not have those skills but is more numerical could be in finance and accounting. But instead of doing that, they just go out onto eBay, e-jobs, see a job, take it. Often, therefore, you've got a round peg in a square hole. The student is not happy with the job. They become disgruntled. You get social problems, alcohol, drugs. They're disruptive in their family and in their relationship. And you get a whole raft of problems, which then society has to pay a lot of money to come in and try and resolve. So, and you're not getting the benefit of that person being a really optimal provider in the society. So when you look at a society like, say, Singapore, where not everybody is a mathematical genius or a brilliant economist or a brilliant doctor, but they try and make sure that everybody is in the right sort of area for their skill set, their personality, and is functioning at the optimal level. And that way they remain competitive in the region against the other challenges. So they've got this absolute focus on maximizing the human resource. And currently, Dan, in Romania, if you look, there's not much oil and gas left now. There's very few other minerals and natural resources.
Well, having resources is not always a blessing. You know, because a lot of resource-rich countries have a lot of problems.
Sure.
Actually, for some of them, it's a curse. For example, Venezuela, because look what happened recently. We can give many more examples of countries not having resources and going all in on human resources. I remember that Samsung's founder, this is exactly what he was writing, nearly 100 years ago when he founded Samsung, when he was, making, lines and saying, okay, what do we have in South Korea?
Yeah.
We don't have agriculture, we don't have minerals, we don't have oil, but we have a very strong and disciplined and human resource.
That's it.
Yeah, and it actually South Korea is punching way above its weight.
Oh, way! I mean, I know South Korea well. I've been going there since I've visited the country since 1982,
and developed world-class
industries and companies that compete and which have been through 3 or 4 cycles. So it's not like they just struck lucky. And which draw exactly as you say off their human resource, their skills, their smarts. They're not just capitalizing on the resources in the ground, extracting the oil and selling it, or the gas or whatever. And they're not in low-end manufacturing. No. They're at the highest end. They're leading it. Their universities are very good. Their schools. If you look at the South Korean education system, I would add, it's very detailed in the way in which it follows students through. You can, to a fair extent, begin to develop a program which allows you to monitor a child aware of where you think some of their needs may be. Now, we don't want to get into the world of Orwell in 1984.
What I was thinking about right now. It sounds pretty.
Yeah, you've got to be very careful how you do this, which is why you need government involved and cross-party and cross-society. You need all areas of the civic society involved in this. But certainly AI needs to be incorporated into education, and we need to be planning it now. There needs to be budget for that. There needs to be expertise. There need to be people brought in from the private sector, either as consultants, on a voluntary basis, on a paid basis, or recruited and recognized for their skills. The Ministry of Education should have a team that really are beginning to analyze what can AI do to help. Because what the Israelis were saying, and the Singaporeans, I was in Singapore in December, just before Christmas, they had similar conversations there. They're looking at how you can incorporate AI, not just to help the most exceptional students, but actually to raise up the standard, because you'll be able to particularize far more. You'll be able, cost effectively, not have to have vast teams of human beings analyzing each child, but look at the whole raft of students, cohort going through a year group and say, look, clearly we've got certain strengths here, certain weaknesses. These students need support on this area, other students need support on that area. And you begin to optimize the performance of that cohort as citizens in the society. You're not looking to use it for political purposes, which may have been the case before '89. You're using it to get the best and the strongest, most coherent cohort of young people coming into the society, whether it be in high opportunity jobs or more routine jobs, but who can do them well because they're well suited, they've been well trained, they're motivated.
Going back to Romania, there were lots of changes in terms of appearance. The curricula is more or less the same that was taught 30 years ago. It's two levels. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's a formal one, which changed a lot and is changing every year, actually. Yeah. And another deeper level, which is pretty much untouched. Yeah. Because when I'm looking at the maths books of my girls, and their maths teacher said something like, "Oh, but the math didn't change." Yeah, I totally agree with him. Mm-hmm. The math didn't change, doesn't change. But the way you teach math, something should change.
And the applicability of mathematics. 35 years ago, AI, IT, algorithms, these were words, expressions you didn't hear used that much. They weren't that integrated. Now, the math has to be both pure mathematical training, but also applied. How are you going to use this skill? Because there's far more opportunities now to apply mathematics and the principles behind it. And that's one of the things with education. As a system develops, I've noticed, here particularly in the UK, I've seen that the use that education gives, the chances and opportunities that education gives to a student increase as the society becomes more aware of the value of that education.
How can you change this deeper level? Because, politically, it's not quite difficult to make reform as long as you're backed by a party and you're in power and so on. So you can say, from now on, I don't know, the year will have 3 modules or whatever, and the exam is going to be like that, blah, blah, blah. But how do you change the way things are taught at a very deeper level, at a lot deeper level, when, your teachers are trained in the same educational system and so on? Yeah. So how do you provoke change in this?
I think it goes beyond education. It becomes part of almost like a master plan for the country. You have to have, as a country, an identity, a sense of your identity. You have to have a belief where you think you want the direction of travel to be and where you want to go on that travel. So, for instance, if you look at, say, I was in Japan I was in Singapore in early December, and then mid-December I was in Japan. In Japan, they buy into Japan, the people. The vast majority think Japan is good, they're proud of it, they want to make it better. So everything is seen through the prism of how they achieve that objective. Now that means they do have master plans. It's not rigid in the sense of communism with an ideology and you have to follow the intellectual rigor in a communist country is close to zero because it just whatever you do has to conform to Marxist theory. The Japanese don't have that. The Singaporeans don't have that.
But China has that.
China has that. And at present, they're marshalling it quite well. But can they actually really continue the development after this early phase, really since about 1980, so 50 years? I mean, I first went to China in 83. It's obviously changed wholesale beyond anybody's imagination. But that's another subject. Coming back to Romania, there's got to be a sort of a key objective that the country, we want to make it better.
A plan for, sorry to interrupt,
sure.
like having a plan on education, for example, for 10, 15, 20 years. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, in part, the danger with plans is a target for people to shoot at. More, to make a plan work, you've got to have the overarching commitment. Firstly, you've got to believe in the country. You can't all be planning to get out and leave and go somewhere else. It doesn't mean you have to just blanket praise it, but you do have to want to make this thing better. And then within that, you recognize, obviously, you need education because that's your raw material, your human resource. You don't have a lot of natural resources. You've got some geographic advantage, but don't overplay that. The Black Sea is controlled by Turkey and Russia, so it's not a great asset. It's a relatively small population, 18 million. Poland's got a much bigger population. So you want to be saying, where can we really optimize our opportunities here? So you want good transport, you want good communications, you have excellent internet, better than the UK. But you don't have good infrastructure.
So what you say is how you play on these strengths and how you develop them further.
Education is one pillar in a successful society. And a successful society is deemed to be successful when people don't want to get out that much. They go for experience. Some of them go for personal reasons, but the majority want to stay and believe that it will offer them a better alternative than elsewhere. So I would like to see Romania over the next 20 years or so have the objective of being a preferred destination rather than what it is now. I'm here, but if I could get to Western Europe or the United States, I'd be better.
So one thing is a coherent plan.
Yep.
Yeah, to have, okay, let's think where we want to be in, 20 years or something like that. But on a more practical level, let's say that, Martin, you're the Minister of Education for the next, 4 years.
Okay.
What would be the first, 3, 4, 5 things you would do to change the system, not only as an image and when the exams are,
Well, firstly, I look at the bottom quartile of students. Because that's where your biggest problem is. That's where you're putting money and resource and getting very little for it.
You know that Romania already has a big dropout problem in that area. One of the biggest in Europe. Maybe.
And not just dropout, but then social issues as well. Drugs, alcohol, violence, you name it. So it's a serious problem. So that would be my number one focus. Let's improve that. Let's raise up from the bottom. Third and second quartiles, I would be looking to audit where the money is being spent, what returns are we getting. Mm-hmm. Do we need to improve the vocational offer there, make it a higher level? You're looking at people who could be trained to be technicians in medicine, in IT, etc., engineering. And then the top quartile is actually the last priority because that's already performing quite well. You don't need a quantum uplift in Polytechnic or a Babiš Bolyai. You don't need a quantum uplift in SA. Yes, there can be improvements, but that bottom quartile is critical. That's flashing red lights, and that is going to be eating into the very fabric of your society, as it has done for the last 10, 15 years. And it's very hard to be successful if your bottom quartile is really just ignored.
A lot of problems are coming from there.
They're disgruntled people because they're just not engaged in society in a meaningful way. They don't have a pathway to improve property ownership, a stable family, being able to plan to give your children a better life than you have had, which are the key ingredients for a successful country. If you've got the ability to, A, have a stake in the country, in the sense of owning a property, maybe owning private savings that allow you to benefit from the growth of the country and to prepare for your retirement, etc. And where you have sufficient funds actually to be a stimulus to economic growth because you can invest in startups, you can invest in stock markets, you can invest in pension plans, etc. but also to have the feeling that you as a person can actually contribute, have a job that's going to be interesting, give you a sense of satisfaction, and that key thing, self-regard. People with self-regard are not normally disruptive, negative influences in society. They're normally much more positive. And you want as much positivity. Nobody wins a football match, and the manager says, we got no hope, and all the players say, we agree. We're going to get clobbered in this match. You have to go out there believing you've got a chance. One of the differences I see down with the students in Romania is, and say in the UK, they're used to seeing on the television news about the stock market, about unemployment, economic news and financial. They see it in the newspaper. Even the tabloids have financial and business information. In Romania, you can get to 18 and have no idea at all.
You were talking earlier about, investments education, for example. Would you modify the actual curricula in Romania, which you know pretty well because we talked a lot about it, with stuff that you find to be important, practical for the world we live in?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects. In the specific, many of the subjects, the curriculum is lacking an opportunity for the students to really engage with the subject and to begin to understand how to build up an understanding. As I said, like the history. They're given the causes of the Second World War. They're not given ideas to consider and prioritize and try and build a view. There is, in that sense, a right answer and a wrong answer. That's one of the legacies of communism. Communism is always a right answer, whatever applied to the Marxist theory, and everything else was wrong. That is not how society works. The second one would be, I think, that you need to bring in soft skills. Now, that's not to say that other countries are much better at this, but they're certainly further up the curve. Every part of society, every country I've been to, and I've been about 80 countries, seems to be lagging in terms of training soft skills to their students. Because soft skills are what allows you to actually go out into the world and function. You've got to be able to speak. You need to understand a degree of leadership. Not that you aim to become prime minister of the country, but that you can use your talents to lead yourself into an effective position. You need to understand what can motivate you, makes you, challenges you. So different sports, different activities, etc.
Doing very complicated mathematics or anatomy or history or whatever, and not knowing anything about investments, for example, or how the society works.
Absolutely.
But it's bonkers. It's crazy because
you're creating basically a one-dimensional concept rather than the full three dimensions. To have the three dimensions, you've got to give people the soft skills, the awareness of their emotions. They don't just what engages their passion, for instance. What are they really interested in? Makes a much, much more valuable citizen. And the schools need to be engaging with that and not fearful of change and soft skill, which is difficult to examine. You're not going to win prizes. You're not going to win Olympiad for many of these things, but they're necessary.
I think all of us agree that we need better education.
But education's one part of the process. Good healthcare. After all, you can be highly educated, but if the healthcare's lousy, you can't even get out of bed. You can't walk, you can't talk, you can't function. You need good communication. You need good roads, good rails, good bridges, everything else, for the society to be able to develop not only the economy but also the complementary elements. You can't have good entertainment unless you've got decent communications. You need a coherent view as to how you're traveling so that you can begin to gauge risk. When you look at investment, it's all about risk. I mean, life is an exercise in risk management. When you get up in the morning, if you step out a door, you could get hit by a meteorite. That's not really a high risk, so therefore most people don't stay at home in a steel bunker. So you need, as a society, to have a risk profile that you're comfortable with. Now, if you look at somewhere like Israel, to come back to that example, their risk profile is very high because they've got direct, life-threatening challenges right on their border. Singapore is not so life-threatening, but they have significant commercial and social and economic challenges, more pronounced than, say, the UK has. So they are very conscious of this. So you buy in, they understand that they have a risk profile, a tolerance, and pretty much that becomes natural part of the governing process. Clearly, you get different views and interpretations. The Americans believe in free enterprise. They believe in private. They're not big on state. Europe, Britain, for instance, is very big on state. We have a legacy. We had such success in the 19th century that naturally part of the society started to go against the traditional accepted success. And that liberal tradition has now developed to such an extent that we've got a very extended welfare state that the country simply can't afford anymore. So there's some problems coming there. Romania's not in that situation yet, but they do need to get this DNA changed that's too cautious, too pessimistic, and too just basically frightened, to put a simple word on it. They need to be more bold, not crazy risk takers, but you need to believe that tomorrow can be better than today.
You mentioned, and I was pretty, attentive about what you said, that the most important thing maybe is to raise the lower segment.
Yeah.
It's very important because a lot of problems are coming from there. How we can practically close this gap? Doing what? Exactly?
I think, firstly, you've got to recognize the problem and not keep sweeping it under the carpet.
Okay.
You've got to then support the people operating at that level, recognizing that probably there need to be some significant changes, including in the personnel. But you must at least break it out as a clear category and give them praise and support, because they are, simply put, the analogy I would use, you've got a 4-story house. The fire is on the ground floor. My advice would be to put the fire out on the ground floor before it reaches the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor. So get in there, put resource, make a plan, try and make it as bipartisan as possible in terms of the politics, so that you don't get a wholesale change every time a party's change or a minister changes, because nothing happens when you have that. It's just a waste of money. Get a degree, if 60 or 70% of the plan can be pretty much agreed, which is what successful countries have when you look at it. United States, Democrat and Republican, they don't wholesale change the education system. Same in most of the countries that are successful.
Well, except this Donald Trump period.
Well, yeah, Donald's a slight exception. Although, don't forget.
I was kidding.
So I think there is change needed. Yes, some of the things that have been going on in education, higher education in America in recent years have been counterproductive. But there is a natural balancing, and it doesn't take 30 years to change a negative trend. It's within 5-10 years, it's pretty much being addressed. So you need that buy-in at the bottom level, because you're putting a lot of resource in there, and you're getting almost zero for it. The top quartile, your Polytechnicas, your Babish Boiler, you're getting a good return on your investment there. Down the bottom, you're getting nothing. And it ain't smart to be wasting money and getting zero for it. And so you want to start doing that, which means you have to come up with some thorough research, look at other countries, consider what works. In Romanian context, don't just go and say, well, this works in New Zealand, so it must work in Romania. Have a proper, holistic approach to the whole thing.
We actually have a much closer example here in Finland, because Finland has one of the most capable educational systems in the world.
Fantastic education system. Been there, seen it, love it. And they are very generous with their time and support, the Finns. They will more than happily help you. And they're not crazy radical in what they come up with. A lot of it's very, very practical common sense. I mean, things like, for instance, ensuring that the children actually come to school. You've got to make sure that the truancy in Romanian schools in that bottom quartile is very high. They just don't turn up. And nobody does anything about it because, well, they're just useless anyway. You've given up on them by the time they're 12 or 13. You wonder why you have a problem when they get to 18. So you have to get them into school, and school's got to be interesting, not just a sort of slightly watered-down version of the high academic standards at Tudor Viano in Bucharest.
That's an interesting comparison, yeah.
Yeah, but make actually a relevant education for them that speaks their language, which is probably fairly direct, straightforward, practical, get them doing practical programs, making things, understanding simple tasks, get them out into the workforce on secondment. Maybe they do a month working in a factory or something or other. So they begin to get a sense of adult life, and they get a sense of responsibility. They get a coherence in their life. A lot of these kids, when I talk to them, they've got very little sense of responsibility. They've got very little sense of personal identity, let alone self-worth. The self-worth is often created at the margin by being extreme, by being very rude, very aggressive, sometimes violent, breaking rules, stealing. You find a lot of them damage property, any public property, they vandalize, etc. And that's not because they're inherently bad, it's because they're not being trained and schooled the right way. So get them under greater control. Have a program that begins to develop them. And then that you start to put out the fire on the ground floor of the house.
So you definitely consider that school, together with parents, have a big part of responsibility, not only in terms of education, standard education, but also in the broader sense of the term.
Oh yeah,
like,
I mean, well,
it's
a
educating
fact.
citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fact that if you look at the higher attaining students, the majority of them come from socially more developed families. There are wonderful examples. I have many friends who came from very modest circumstances and excelled in formal education, and many of them went on to be admirable citizens. However, when you look at the top universities anywhere in the world, you'll see the vast majority of the students come from a more privileged background, educated parents, higher income, etc. So you have to work with the parents to give them a concept of parenting and family that's relevant to their socioeconomic position, which means you've got to support them on simple things like getting their kid into school. Don't let the kid just play truant. Explain the benefit of school. That's got to be tangible for these people. They're not that sophisticated. So you've got to show them there's some tangible benefit. And that means showing they've got a better route to a job, they can earn some money, etc., and be able to contribute to the family. You can work with other social institutions like the church, like charities, like sport. I mean, Romania during the communist time had quite an interesting concept in the sense of these sort of massive sports complexes. Sport is an important part of this. They built a lot of sports, sala de sport.
I remember that pretty well.
Yeah.
Because, look, when I was a kid, in my block of flats, there were 20 kids, let's say. Actually, if I remember well, 17 or 18 of them, myself included, were doing sports like
Absolutely.
2 times a week.
Oh, yeah.
Like going to the club with your rucksack and with your, shoes in your backpack.
And to meet as a community, to take on something where you had challenge, you had the pleasure of success, you had to come to terms with defeat. It was a good training for life. Simple as that. Sport is not for everybody. I'm not saying everybody has to play sport 5 hours a day, but it should be available and encouraged and explained and readily accessible. And these assets cost money, but their return on these assets is huge. So many other traditional elements of society are being challenged by technology, which is inevitable. You can't do anything about it. So kids no longer have to go outside to get entertainment. They can just do it when I was a kid in England, there were 2 television channels. They didn't have anything of any particular interest on until about 6 o'clock in the evening. So we used to get up and go out and play football because there's nothing else to do. And that meant you form teams, you learn interpersonal social skills. Now kids can spend half the day just on their own. A friend of mine talked about lockdown. She made a very good point. Her son stayed with her for, I think, 3 or 4 months, so he didn't go out, didn't go to school. She said what he lost was his social skills because he had complete control over his environment because everything was his laptop. So if he didn't like what somebody was saying on a group chat on the laptop, he just muted them. Or even he just exited the group. So he could completely curate his own day, who he met, what he heard, what he interacted with. And as she said, when he went back out into the normal world, he had to adjust again to the fact there was the kid at school who annoyed him. He couldn't just mute them. He couldn't just exit the group. He had to learn those skills again. He had to learn to go to a store to buy something and find they just sold the last one. whereas he was used to buying everything through eMag, where he went on, saw they had it available, knew what time it was going to arrive, everything. His whole life was curated, and he didn't have that variable element, and that's essential because that's part of real life. So you need to get that back. So it's a big task, and it seems massive, but actually once you get into it, a lot sort of just naturally follows. When those kids go out ill-equipped for life, they become a cost to society. They vandalize, they get in trouble with the law, they get in relationship problems. You start getting people, spousal abuse, whatever, all of which costs money. They end up in prison. Hideously expensive place to keep people. Where it's much, much cheaper and easier in terms of return on your investment. Build a better system to be more inclusive on that bottom quartile, which will filter up to the third quartile. If the bottom half of your society is functioning well, you've got a pretty healthy society.
My next question is about this big debate which took place in Romania and still takes place about public schools and public education versus private schools, private education. Sure. In Romania, the problem is that even if you have the money to use for your kids to get to have a good education, you may fail.
Yes,
even
it's very easy to fail because, after all, if you begin with the reason that the business opportunity I saw was that there's a deficit in people's minds between what's available in Romania and what's available outside. Now, outside could be America, it could be Europe, it could be wherever. And if you can afford to access what's outside, then you can bridge that deficit. Now, the deficit, some occasions, some families I've met, I think they exaggerate the deficit. They make Romania out to be almost in the Stone Age and everything in Western Europe to be, amazing.
And that's not true.
That's not true. Mm-hmm. You can go to a private university in England and waste your money, trust me, quite a lot of it, and come out with a certificate that's almost valueless, particularly in the international market. You may be able to come back to Romania where they haven't heard of the university and say, well, here, I've got a degree from England. But pretty quickly, people realize you didn't learn very much. But in the UK, you won't get a job. People just say, no, forget it. Or you'll get a job, but it's one you could have got without that qualification, so you need to spend the money. So that perceived deficit, we can address that because we understand what is on offer outside the country. And we understand Romania, so we know where it can fit. If a family comes to me and they say they want their child to go, say, for instance, to Harvard University, the first question you ask is, which school are they at now? And that keys into the second question, can you show me the last 2 school reports? And you find out that the child's in a very low-performing school and it's right in the bottom quartile of that school quota. Well, it's not going to go to Harvard. Okay. You're looking for that is the top percentage. So you have to give realistic advice. There are snake oil salesmen out there, some of whom represent universities and institutions, and they're saying to you, look, sign up, come to our university, and everything will be glorious. Once you've signed and paid the money, you find it's not quite as glorious as you thought. So you need good advice. It's like anything. There's a lot of offers, and you need people who are informed, but informed on both ends. We know not only what's in Britain, America, the Netherlands, France, Germany, but we also understand Romania. So we know where, if somebody's at a particular school and doing very well, we know they ought to be applying to the highest standards. The parents may come and say, well, we've heard of this university. You say, no, actually, you should be going above that. You should be aiming for much higher because your child is far more capable. And then there's areas like, for instance, medicine. Medical schools in the UK get between 13 and 15 applicants for every place, of whom at least 5 or 6 are going to get very outstanding exam results. So how do you differentiate yourself within that cohort so that you're the person who gets that place when the other 13 or 14 students unfortunately get rejected? Medicine's an example. It's all about empathy. The academics, yes, they're required, but it's not the sole determinant. They want to see in a British medical school that you have sufficient empathy to be an effective doctor. And one of the things that a number of them have done recently, they bring in, at the interview stage, they bring in mini interviews. And these are actors playing the part. So the student who's applying goes into a room and there's a woman sitting there and she can't speak. She's in shock. Now, it's an actress playing the part. But that student has 3 minutes, which is being monitored, to engage that person, that woman, and find out, at least begin in that 3 minutes to show, A, that they realise, not just stand there shouting at her saying, say something, but to engage and find out maybe some awful trauma, and she's in shock. Whatever. Go into the next room, 3 minutes, a man who's very angry, and you've got to get through that anger, placate him to the level that you can find out why he's needing medical support. And you go into another room, and 3 minutes, a woman is crying. And again, you've got to find out what's making her or him cry. So these are sort of, and you can prepare students for this, you can train them, give them support. So it's understanding the system, and it's understanding the full range of opportunities.
So that's where you come in, like advising?
Advising. We're an advisory. I would say we are a concierge service for families with regard to their children from 10 years of age to 22, their development. So the specific of advising on schools and universities, that's quite a specific offer. Look at the child, look at the family profile, look at their economic circumstances, etc., and make a relevant recommendation as to a portfolio of schools to apply to, same with the universities. Soft skills, opening up opportunities for their children to develop from the age of 10, not just at 15 or 16 when they're beginning to think about university, but to go through, to learn more skills, have more experiences, have a richer pool of experience in which to build their young adult life and preparing to go into full adult life. We also advise parents, because one of the things I discovered as we built the business is that there are a lot of parenting issues. Now, I'm a parent, and I know that, yes, of course, you have anxiety with regard to your child. It's very rare that, I've never yet met a parent actually who said, well, my car's my number one priority, my wristwatch collection's my number two, and then my kids. No, the kids are always at the top of the pile.
We're coming to a close. One last question. If
Sure.
you had to choose just, let's say, 2 or 3 indicators of a working educational system, what would be those?
Truancy rate, the number of students who stay in beyond the minimum age at which you can leave, and here's quite hard to pin down, but the attraction of teaching and education as a profession.
It's a good one.
If you have to corral people, if you have to come up with all sorts, either you lower the entry, which is what happens a lot, because you can't increase the salaries because the budgets are constrained, public expenditure is limited. So how do you get more people into teaching? Well, you open the doors to everybody. Anybody. Teaching should be a select profession. It doesn't have to be necessarily incredibly difficult to it, but you need to be able to pass muster. So those 3 things, I think. If the kids are missing school, then you're getting something wrong. There'll always be a delinquent community, an element that will do. And there'll be some with certain circumstances, problems at home, etc.
Yeah, but when it's, 17% dropping, it's
and that's
it's a bad
across the board. If you go to certain specific schools, you'll find it's more like 50, 60%. And then what is absenteeism? They come 1 hour a day. They come 1 day a week. But it's a big problem. But I would finish on one key point. It's right to be concerned by education and to be critical of the provision and the state of education. But the key thing about education is you can always be positive, because it's so valuable that even a poor system is delivering something, but you can improve it very quickly and not necessarily by throwing money at it. There are plenty of examples I can show you of schools and systems, countries that have thrown vast amounts of money at education and not got much return from it. And others, like Finland, for instance, who've had a coordinated plan. They're not doing anything that Romania couldn't do. If they just, get the consensus, devote some human as well as financial resource. Education often doesn't reward the way, say, for instance, business does. But you need to reward people. And you need to find people who want to engage in it. And in Finland, they've achieved something. And I know Finland quite well. I've spoken to a lot of people there. It wasn't originally like this. They were more like a normal country. Mm-hmm. But then they said, look, let's get together. They created a cohort of people. They gave them enough political support that they could get on with the job instead of chopping and changing. They gave them enough budget to do it, but not allowing them to just go out and buy success because they knew you couldn't do that. And they created a really good system that now is so strong that it can withstand, the challenge of AI, the whole introduction of digital. They breeze through that, making 2 + 2 into 5 every time. Whereas a lot of countries, not just Romania, have been challenged by it, and then 2 has become 1.5, let alone 2 + 2 becoming 4, or Finland 5. They've taken 2 and become 1.5 because they've just been overwhelmed by it. Because they don't have that consensus that you need a coherent plan which links in with the country's needs, broader needs, which is not rocket science. Mm-hmm. And then you need the momentum to make it happen, which means you need some talented people. You need a lot of other people that are committed, not necessarily the natural leaders. And you need to reward people for it. The Minister of Education should be one of the most important people in the country. And when you think about it, you're not at war. I mean, Romania hasn't actually fired a bullet in anger for a long time. So your Minister of Minister of Defence is important, but not exactly mission critical. Education is 24/7.
Yeah.
365 days a year.
And affecting millions and millions and millions of people.
It's having probably a bigger effect on the national economy than the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Industry. It's having a bigger effect on the security of the country than the security services or the foreign ministry or anybody. So in that sense, it should, be given massive status and regard. Not false status, not infinitely sort of bowing and scraping in front of the Minister of Education, but just recognise the importance of what I just said. When did Romania last fire a gun in anger? I think it was about 1944. Maybe the Minister of Defence is not quite so mission critical as the fact that you're churning out kids who are becoming not contributing the optimal level, and are therefore the society is losing out. So while we've been talking, the society has to some small extent deteriorated further because you don't have a good educational system. Whereas the attacks on the country from foreign military has not exactly been a significant change while we've been talking. So invest in education and believe in it. It's a great, it's a gift that really does keep giving.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much
Dan.
for having you here.
That's good.
Eu sper că v-a plăcut discuția. A fost densă, am sărit de la una la alta, dar și subiectele zic eu că au fost numeroase, iar topicul ăsta al educației este unul extrem de vast și, așa cum povesteam aici, de important. Eu vă mulțumesc tuturor și ne vedem luni cu un nou video pe zonă. Hai, baftă vouă tuturor!